I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry.
So, on today's episode of the podcast, we are talking about The Self and the Future by Bernard Williams, a pivotal essay in the philosophy of the self and identity.
Yes. Yeah, and, Bernard Williams, a juggernaut of British philosophy, very influential, and usually, in my experience, a joy to read. This might be the exception to the rule, where I feel like Williams is, a typical whimsy kind of gets lost in some very, let's say, I wouldn't call it quite technical, because he never quite gets technical, but convoluted prose, right? There's lots of different variations of some thought experiments in here. Not a lot of road mapping, and some subtle points that I don't think are necessarily incredibly well supported, but are padded out by lots of fluff.
Yeah.
So I think there's a weird mix of vices in here, and there's also, of course, some important ideas. So we have to sort of sift the wheat from the chaff in this episode.
Yes. It's funny that you say he's a good writer usually, because I think this might be the only Williams I've read, and it was a slog for me. I was having a really hard time, and just thinking back, Nagel was so nice last week.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, Williams has his moments. He's normally a lot more approachable than he is in this particular article. So give him another chance if this is your first experience with Bernie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other suggestions?
Just almost anything that you come across. He's normally he writes a lot of sort of philosophy on generalist subjects, and I think that he's a lot more approachable than he is here, where he's talking about personal identity. But we should probably just get to the piece at hand instead of trying to distract our audience with better Bernard Williams articles. Let's stick with what we have. So what we have is a potted introduction to the topic of personal identity through the thought experiment, which comes from John Locke of The Prince and the Cobbler. Now, as a philosophy student yourself, you've had experience discussing Locke, I suppose. And could you describe to us this thought experiment, roughly speaking?
Yeah, Locke says that you have this prince and the cobbler, some poor dude. They switch bodies, their minds go into each other's bodies, and
through magic.
Yeah.
Didn't have necessarily very complicated brain surgery in Locke's time, so we'll just assume that it's affected by magic or not worry ourselves about how this happens.
Yeah. And he wanted to show, I believe, that the self is consistent through memory, and is defined by our consistent memories.
Yeah, so the self for Locke is a overlapping series of memories that can recall each other, and as long as there's a direct path from an earlier version of ourselves to a later version of ourselves, as long as some memories exist. They don't need to all exist all the time, but enough of the rope has to exist that it makes a continuous thread. So you might think about this as the example of the old general, right? The old general has memories of being the young lieutenant, and the young lieutenant has memories of the boy who was whipped on the farm or whatever, right? And so by the time you become the old general, you lose the memory of being whipped on the farm, but you remember being the young lieutenant. The young lieutenant obviously doesn't have any memory connection with the old general in the future, but remembers being the boy whipped on the farm. So there's a chain, right? C remembers being B, who remembers being A, even though C has no memory of being A. Mm-hmm. and so we maintain identity through our memories as long as there's a reasonable series of links. So looking at it like that, right, as long as the prince has an overlapping memory of being in one body and then being in another body mysteriously, identity is, from this point of view, preserved, no problem. And furthermore, right, Locke points out that it's the mannerisms of the, let's say, the personalities that are animating the bodies that gives us, the clues about their true identity or their knowledge of things that only they could know. So, purely mental properties are determinative of identity here.
Yeah. And I guess Williams takes issue with this
yes,
in setting up multiple thought experiments. But the one that stuck with me was talking about being tortured in the future and then not remembering it. He thinks that we should still feel worried about that, or we would still feel worried about that. And that proves that even if we can't remember what's going to happen to us, there's still a you that we're concerned about that happening to, even if we have no recollection of that happening to that person.
Right. We're rather attached to our bodies, as it turns out. Do you think that Williams is persuasive on this point?
No.
Why not? Let's get to it right away. Let's start getting critical.
Because I've had laughing gas before, or laughing gas. I think that's what when you're in the dentist, and they put you under. You're not
nitrous oxide, I think it's called.
Yeah, there you go. Nitrous oxide. You're not actually being put under. Like, you feel everything, you just don't remember. And I do the same thing again, and that has no bearing on what I consider to be me, that space of time. Okay. And I don't fear that in the future, I guess.
Okay, so I don't know. You hear with these horror stories about dentists, right? Dentists that fondle patients once they're under with the gas. You think that there's no reason for you to feel badly about a fondling that you have no memory of in the dentist chair? Is that what you're saying, Zan? You're saying fondle away to your dentist if he's listening? Not to put too fine a point on it, but that seems problematic, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
I mean, I'm going to say that you have some interest in what happens to your body, even if you have no sensory perception or memory of it.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
That just seems to go with having a body, but I wonder if, right, the problem with Williams's thought here is that we normally don't have the power to switch bodies, and so our preconception about the subject is rather fixed because we don't know what it would be like to inhabit a different body or to vacate one permanently and, take up residence in another.
A la Thomas Nagel.
Yeah. So given that, right, we have a tendency, I think, to nod along with Williams, even though maybe we shouldn't in this case, right? If a full, let's say body exchange, as we're going to call it just for the sake of brevity, is possible, then maybe we shouldn't. We shouldn't care. And maybe our intuitions to the contrary just indicates that we live in a world where these kinds of transformations, magical or surgical, just don't happen.
Yeah, I think I had a similar intuition. I think I had a bit of trouble tracking the article, but I do tend to have some problems with these sort of super abstract thought experiments that we're trying to find evidence or glean evidence from when it's so far removed from reality that it's hard to call it that.
Yeah, I find that a lot of articles that work in the space of personal identity function a lot of the time as intuition pumps, right? And so like they can be tweaked to get you to agree to a certain conclusion without reflecting objectively, I think, on what's being put forward. Like it leans a lot into just the way that we normally think and conduct ourselves, and are, without much in the way of argument.
Yeah, I think Williams himself even talks about that a little bit, and how just how you might frame one thought experiment of being changed into someone else's body, and the way that's described to you as one person who switches over gets $100,000, the other person gets tortured. The way that's phrased can really change how you think about the scenario.
Yeah, if the person in power or the experimenter keeps using you as the subject of the sentence, then that's more terrifying, right? Than if he just says the person, the person who comes out the other end has this done to them. That seems less terrifying. So yeah, the way that the thought experiment is phrased has a lot to do with the conclusions that we arrive at by use of the thought experiment. So he's aware of this for sure, but at the same time, I wonder if he isn't helping himself to a bit of it as well. Let's talk then about the future torture thought experiment and what it's supposed to prove. So he thinks that, for example, if, and this is on page number 494, right? He says that the A body person and the B body person in the experiment, one of them is going to be given $100,000 after the experiment of the body exchange, while the other is going to be tortured. We then ask each A and B to choose which treatment should be dealt out to which of the persons who will emerge from the experiment. The choice to be made, if it can be, on selfish grounds. Suppose that A chooses that the B body person should get the pleasant treatment, right, assuming that A's mind is put in B's body, and the A body person the unpleasant treatment, because then by A's personality will be out of that body, or their experience will be housed in B's body. And B chooses conversely. This might indicate that they thought that changing bodies was indeed a good description of the outcome. So he goes through a couple of iterations of this thought experiment, which all seem to confirm the fact that the body doesn't matter, right, in terms of personal identity. And then he tries to sort of reintroduce why the body might matter, right? And the idea is that you'll have some sort of vested interest, right? Still, if you describe the situation slightly differently, you'll still have a vested interest in your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he said that would also like add to the terror, right? That this would... you'd be told that you would be getting tortured and that all your memories of this would be wiped. Again, I think that's pretty terrifying, but maybe more because of the torture part.
Let's say, for instance, then, though, that, you further say that something terrible will certainly happen to you while you're blacked out, but don't worry, you'll have no memory of it, right? That's still worrying, like we pointed out before. I think, though, that if we live in the kind of world where these kinds of body exchanges can happen, maybe the idea that this body really matters so much kind of goes out the window. So I think that the thing is, we don't normally think about things from the science fiction frame that the thought experiment is being presented from. And there's a cultural gap between our world and that world, and a lot of the intuitive persuasiveness comes from turning this world's values on that world's realities, and assuming that nothing about us will change in the meantime, which seems false, right?
Yeah, so can you set up like the alternative world that you're talking about a bit more? Or?
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, okay, so in the world where we can switch bodies at will and let's say it's just as common as a telephone booth used to be, or I don't know what's the equivalent now, a change room or something. There's change rooms all over the place, and instead of a room where you change clothes, you change bodies.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's just like at every couple of blocks, there's just a little booth where two people can go in, put the helmets on, flick a switch, and they change bodies. Okay, so it becomes banal. It becomes ordinary. And I think in that world, we do lose all intuitions that we should care about what happens to the body that we were previously inhabiting.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's just this world where we're stuck, like literally stuck in one body until we die. And there's no way out of it, as far as we can tell. That the strong intuition that the body matters to who we are kind of sticks around. I think that there's a different argument, though, that Williams sort of points out in different ways throughout the article, which kind of is more convincing, right? So there's a sort of hint of this when he talks about on page number, I think it's, 493, right? He says that, again, he says, if they were of a different sex, right? So if A and B change bodies and they are of different sex, there may be grave difficulties in reading B's dispositions and any possible performances of A's body. So there is kind of an interesting kernel of, I think, the real position that Williams is getting at, in that, the stuff that I have that's mine and that nobody else has makes me me in a way that nothing else can. So let's say that I get transferred to a body that is that of a smaller woman's with a higher voice. Then everything that I'm trying to do, everything that I'm performing and projecting in this body, it comes out strange. It comes out weird in that body, and it might not be an effective strategy for rolling around the world in that body. And so I might have to change to fit the body. The body may not have to change to fit me, so to speak, right? Yeah. And so I think that he's pointing out something there, right? That who we become in terms of our personality and in terms of the memories that we accumulate is proportionally relational to the kind of embodied cognition and experience that we have.
Yeah. And I mean, that seems fairly like a fairly inarguable point. Like I'm listening to an audiobook right now, and they talked about children who are born with both male and female genitalia, right. And they'll make a decision and get rid of one of those genitalia, and it will have huge consequences on that person's life. They'll feel like they may be a girl or a boy and not have the corresponding parts. And yeah, that pretty profoundly affects how they view themselves and the world around them. I think, like, also too, I was thinking about how a big part of our identity is how we're interpreted by other people. And I think he kind of is pointing to those sort of things. So yeah, I think I have sympathy for that position. But
yeah, let's go back to the prince and cobbler for a second, right? So imagine that the prince can't convince anybody he's in the body of the cobbler, and he can't get back into his castle, and he's stuck, in the cobbler's shop, and you just got person after person coming in saying, fix my shoes, and throwing money at the guy, less money than he's accustomed to seeing, of course. And it all seems rather brutish and insulting to him, because he's used to being attended by servants and whatnot. How long is it before the prince starts to act in the same way the cobbler did, or worse, right? Given that he's not used to this kind of labor and station in life.
Yeah. With this thought experiment, I just, for some reason, the prince always has the voice of, like, once they body swap, like Pinky from Pinky and the Brain, and he's just acting like him, like, and everyone's confused. Well, why is the prince acting this way?
Give us the
realizing.
You got to do the impression now.
Big metal donut.
Well, I mean, so we do have some pop culture links to this kind of literature, right? So we have like Freaky Friday, for the old schoolers, and we have the new Jumanji for people who were raised on Netflix, right? Where people are swapping bodies and their personalities are changing, growing as a result, right? So if you go to the original, say, Freaky Friday scenario, the girl who doesn't understand her mother comes to understand her mother and starts to do different things than her mother would with her mother's powers, so to speak. And so sort of like it's an opportunity for growth and change, but it also comes at a sacrifice with everything that we're comfortable with and used to, right? And so I think that, obviously, when would you, if you lived in a world, right, where Freaky Friday scenarios were available in booths with the flick of a button, how often would you do this? Would you change personalities as often as you do socks? Or would you be a little bit more cautious about this? Like, would you really want to like do months and months of research before you seriously contemplate a trade with somebody?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thought experiment, right? I think you're
perhaps more interesting than Williams is.
Actually. Again, an intuition pump here, but my intuition is that the sense of there being a self at all would dissolve the more you did it. Again, while we were talking about references, I was kind of thinking about Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Like he has his memories when he turns into a bug, so he still has that solid sense of self, but the more time he spends in that bug body, it's been a while since I read it, but I think he starts to take on sort of bug attributes, and his memories fade of him being
his
that
tastes start to
previous...
change too, right? He finds things delicious that bugs find delicious. Which is disturbing at first, but then he gets it really into it. You might also remember Lady and the Fox, right? The novel that we studied in philosophy and literature. Right, so there are different depictions of just this, and we're talking about obviously humans turning into beasts, which seems like we are really losing something, right? So I'm just talking now about human to human switches, not into sort of like alien life forms. We're not going to solve Nagel's what it is like to be a bat by putting a bat in the other pod in the booth where we change bodies. Although it'd be a fine story still, I'm sure. But I think his point here is that the more similar the candidate is in most regards, the less jarring this switch is going to be, the less radically traumatic, let's say the adjustment process is going to be.
Yeah,
because Kafka's guy, he had it tough, right?
Yeah,
waking up as a giant beetle. It's not one of the kinder hands that fate could give you, right?
You're not waking up as Chris Evans or Brad Pitt,
right? Exactly. Right. Let's take this out for a spin. See what happens. So where were we at here? We're talking about, right, in this world where you can switch bodies frivolously if you want to. I mean, are we now? I mean, goodness, I'm realizing as I'm speaking that we might be talking about sexual morality unintentionally.
Yeah.
Right. So like the hookup culture, right? So that seems to me to be a place where people are trying out different bodies. They're just not switching them completely. But you're kind of you're getting as intimate as you possibly can with somebody in a kind of frivolous way. And some people describe being part of the hookup culture as a kind of loss of self, right? Like if you give yourself up too freely in this way, you can lose respect for yourself. You can lose a sense of self, right? And I think that's part of the reason why sexual morality exists, right? To try to preserve personal integrity to some degree. insofar as you can do that, as far as that's possible. If there is a reason for sexual morality at all, it has to be something along those lines.
Yeah, that's an interesting like parallel to run around it. And yeah, I guess again, this is why I think like memory and embodiment is both important, right? Because yeah, if you're just constantly like going into the booth and switching into a different body, you need some sort of memory to hold consistently in order to, I think, have any sort of sense of self.
Well, isn't the idea that you would switch your body from the very beginning an indication that you lack an appropriate amount of self-respect or a more proper
curiosity, though?
Right.
And
yes,
I guess
the sort of like the scientific, sort of attitude, right? Like I've got to try out as many different bodies as possible for science.
well, I think like again, maybe with sexual morality, like it's becoming closer with the other, or trying to
right
bridge the gap between you and the other.
Yeah. Which brings us back again to Martha Nussbaum, right? Martha Nussbaum says we should read lots of different, novels and watch different movies so we can get closer to the world as other people experience it and describe it, so we can enhance our empathetic capacities. Maybe sleeping with a lot of different people is another way to get those capacities, right? Possibly, right? To be more sex positive than my previous sort of sex conservative view, right? That might be a more positive way of looking at it, What's the best way to be empathetic?
Yeah, or I guess just like in a like metaphysical sense, kind of like if you were able to switch bodies with someone every day for a year, I think you'd learn something about. Like, I guess that was another problem I had with Williams, is he's trying to define the self, and I think the self is very hard, if not undefinable, or very hard to define, if not undefinable. Like we can point to certain characteristics, but I guess there's no real essence of what the self is.
Yeah, and interestingly, we are largely a mystery to ourselves, right? Other people see us more clearly, usually, than we're able to see ourselves. We can introspect, but that seems to be an imperfect means of self-knowledge.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with a book called Black Like Me?
No.
So there was an American author who wanted to see what it was like to be a black in the American South in a time where going around in blackface was probably still bad, but not as bad as it is now. And so he got some very sophisticated makeup applied and went through the American South and kept a journal of how he was treated. And, of course, the findings were appalling. Yeah. He was, in essence, the same person, upstairs, right, in terms of his personality. It's just that his carriage was a different color, and that's all that had changed. But it radically transformed his experience of America, right, as a person moving through it and working in it. So I think that's also, right, if you're looking at body swapping as a sort of way to grow your empathic qualities, maybe you'd want to do that kind of thing, right? You want to switch races and genders and sexual orientations, perhaps, right? To sort of make sure that you're the least bigoted person that you can be at the end of your many experiences. Yeah, or I guess just like we were talking about feminist epistemology in class a little while ago, and I guess from an epistemic point of view, like being able to experience the world literally through someone else's eyes might get you to closer objectivity on certain things. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some sort of biological principle at work here, right? It's energy conservation. I think that this kind of imaginative work that we need to do to be empathetic, to imagine what it is like to occupy somebody else's societal position or bodily frame, it just takes a lot of the CPU is pretty hot, right? It's humming in the background. So I think that we don't often do it because it requires concentration, free time, other resources to sort of support it, right? And in a world where we are literally incapable of making that kind of transformation, it might seem like a waste of time. Well, why would I think about that? I'm never going to be one of those, whatever those are, to that person saying that, right? And so I guess that a lot of the intellectual and emotional complacency comes from a place where people with scarce resources are being asked to do thought experiments that they don't see the purpose of, right? So it's a particularly anti-philosophical urge, which I don't necessarily sympathize with, but I understand. Yeah. I get why people, aren't more empathetic and understanding with each other, but it's a sad fact that we can't all live on philosophical research grants and just sit around wondering what it would be like to inhabit different bodies. Now, that would be some sort of philosopher's utopia, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. So I guess with Williams, like he overemphasizing how much we identify the self with the body, do you think? Like I kind of get that sense, but I think towards the end he's more just saying that it's complicated, dude. Like, yeah,
I mean that's more or less I think where it ends up. But I mean, I think if I'm going to be a bit more charitable, I might say that Williams is saying that you're nobody without your body, right? He disagrees with Descartes. He thinks that, you can't just have a floating mind without some form of embodiment. So given that that's the case, your body tells you almost everything that's important about who you are. Right, or at the very least, everything that you are is shaped by and filtered through that matrix.
Yeah, okay. I think that's something that I agree with. But yeah, I still think that memory is probably mostly where we contain our sense of self and other people's.
Yeah, I think he thinks that too, right? He thinks memory is important as well, but it's just he's saying, hey, look, both's important. And in the history of philosophy, people like Locke have tended to underemphasize or, downplay how much the body really does matter in terms of personal identity. So I feel like if there's a sort of coherent philosophical project being advanced here, it's trying to reinstate or revalorize the body as a source of personhood.
Yeah, okay. That clears things up for me. And yeah, I guess makes a lot of sense to me. And like reading through the article, I was thinking about the trans experience.
Right. It's naturally came to mind, yeah.
Yeah, and how people will feel a certain way within their body and going through certain procedures or transitioning, a lot of people talk about how they feel truly themselves. And I think that really points to this sense of embodiment and how it relates to our sense of self.
Well, this gets us into another interesting topic, right? So transhumanism, right? So the idea that, this stage of our evolution is not the ultimate one, and we ought to be a lot more daring with regard to the kind of genetic and robotic enhancements that we allow humans to employ. I think that, this is very much, sort of along that line, in that, if you, for instance, need to change your body to see the world a certain way, and there's no other way to accomplish that feat, then it seems to me like that's one of the projects that can give your life meaning. It ought to be respected as one of the goals that you have that makes you. And there's different manifestations of that, right? There are bodybuilders who, will radically change their lifestyles in dangerous ways to try to achieve their ideal form for the purposes of competition, or maybe just to make themselves feel good about how they look. And we don't really bat an eye. We say, well, that's a coherent life plan for a certain kind of person with a certain range of interests, right? It might not be, I mean, it could be as dramatic, but it might not be as dramatic as the urge to change one's sex, right? Or it might not be as dramatic as the urge to become a cyborg either. But I mean, I think these are kind of points on a line where, to realize some good that you value, you need to transform yourself. And I think that without that power, without that power, we're inert. And so I think there's two ways to be inert. There's sort of like a powerless kind of inertia, and then there's a powerful inertia, right? So if you're happy with who you are, then that's great, I suppose, right? I'm number one, why try harder, right? You might think to yourself. And if you're that kind of person, right, who's that phlegmatic about existence, I think that's kind of a gift. That's what the Stoics seem to be after, that kind of contentment. But for those who, aren't like that, right? There's people who feel that they're just powerless to change the world, and I think for those people, being themselves is a horrible trap. And so I think that they have to sort of mod on various programs of self-improvement to make life bearable.
Yeah, well, this just made me think about why Nietzsche thinks that envy is a good thing, because you see qualities in other people that you lack, like almost in a virtue ethics sort of way, right? You see the great piano player and you think, God, I want to know how to rip up and down the piano like that. And it's that sense of lack that keeps you striving for something and gives you a sense of meaning in your life.
Yeah, I think that that can be encouraging and productive, whereas just hatred. Look at that guy on the piano. I'm going to smash his fingers. That might not be as let's say aspirational.
Yeah,
that's I'm sure that's just a different kind of thing than what Nietzsche's talking about. Yeah, so our bodies make us who we are, but they also, in doing so, set a whole bunch of limits on what we can't be. Right, and I think that's sort of the line that Williams is drawing kind of obliquely here. We can't understand it all. We can't feel it all. We can't be it all because we're an embodied lump, and we're a certain kind of embodied lump, and we're different than other embodied lumps. And that gives us our personhood. And it also robs us of the opportunities of other kinds of experience.
Yeah, I guess
that's just that's the price of playing the game.
Yeah, we have to be confined by certain things, or there's no self to hold on to, or any sort of meaning or purpose to anything, right? Yeah, like you said, rules of the game. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I guess though, it's I gravitate more towards and I think most people do, again, maybe just referencing Nietzsche, like the will to power. It's you want to maximize your capabilities, your body's capabilities.
So I think maxing out is a different process than radically transforming your body, right? So in a lot of ways, like radically transforming your body is going to lead you to not be able to realize certain capacities.
Yeah, put limitations
you're
where they may have not been before.
Yeah.
Or different limitations.
Different, yeah. So it might open up new capacities. It might also truncate other possibilities. Right, whereas like if you're just maxing out your stats, right, you're using what's already there, and you're just seeing, okay, well, given that this is what I've been dealt with, right? What can I do, right? Whereas I think this sort of urge that might make an A want to become a B in the sort of thought experimental scenario of, wanting to switch bodies, right? That's something different, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of like, well, I'm not even interested in seeing what this can do if it's maxed out. I want a new problem. I want a new hand dealt to me. And then maybe I'll see what I can do with that. But I don't like this hand. I'd rather have that hand. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like in a role-playing game or something like that, right? You might inhabit different characters rather than getting invincibility or something because they present new challenges. Yeah.
Or let's say maybe you just become the perfect version of yourself. You've realized all the capacities in this body that you can. And you're like, okay, I want to try a new game. This one, I'm playing on easy mode now with this body in this life.
Yeah, yeah.
Give me a challenge, right? Give me.
That's where I'm at all the time.
Right?
Life's too easy.
Yeah. Give me cancer or something.
Oh, God.
This is the kind of thing that someone says before they're struck down by God in a sort of like in a morality play. But yeah, so I don't think anybody's putting themselves, not many people anyway, are putting themselves in the face of oncoming traffic for the purpose of making their life harder and seeing like, oh wow, what can I do now with these diminished capacities?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna say it's only the elite minority that probably have this kind of problem, and for most of us, life's just tough enough as it is.
Yeah.
Without added infirmities or injuries.
Yeah.
Or afflictions, right?
Yeah.
And if it's not a problem now, just wait till you age, like 30 years or whatever, and then you'll have a whole new host of problems.
You'll get there.
Yeah, you'll get there.
Yeah.
You'll get to a more challenging stage, right? Mm-hmm. But so I don't know. What are we talking about? We're talking about, whether or not the road to happiness. I suppose that if we want to move away from Williams into a sort of more general close here, right? We might say, well, what's the real road to happiness for people? And there might be multiple roads to happiness for people, right? Is it having the body that you have now and just kind of like settling with that and working with it? Or is it trying to transcend the body? I think these are two different kinds of urges. And I think that philosophers have always tried, or at least traditionally tried, to transcend the body. Philosophers historically haven't liked bodies very much. Yeah. They haven't paid much attention to bodies. Now, of course, this is like changing with modern philosophy, but for the most part, people saw the soul or the mind as different substance or in a different realm even. And this world that's disintegrating around us, what goes on, in the sphere of cognition is too pure to, have any point of contact with this world of illusions, right? As Plato might put it, or the sort of world of decay and entropy. So I think that historically, there's been this disconnect between the body and the mind. And I think that, the body rejection, to a large extent, is the history of Western philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting sort of genealogy you span there. It's not one that I had really considered a lot before, but it makes a lot of sense. So Western philosophy is just denying death and decay.
Yeah.
I think that's an interest that it pulls me, because I guess that's one reason I'm drawn to philosophy is that sort of again why I'm pulled to Metamorphosis by Kafka, just that our bodies will fail and that they are imperfect. It's frightening, and just being able to think about abstract ideas that are so much bigger and eternal. There's an appeal to that, I think.
Well, it's part of the Christian influence on Western society, right? The idea that the important stuff happens after you die, and up till then you're just sort of gaining merits and being hit with demerits based on the way that you live. But your intentions and your, let's say, character are the things that are important about you from the Western perspective, right? So, and again, it's supposed from a lot of religious points of view and some metaphysical points of view that you can carry that with you into the afterlife. It's a nice little piece of baggage. But your body sure as hell isn't going anywhere good, right? It's going into a box in the ground or it's getting burnt, right? Those seem to be the two sort of dominant cultural options. We're not at the point where we're turning bodies into Soylent Green and feeding it back to ourselves, thank goodness, but who knows what the future holds. My ex-wife and I had this debate about organ donor cards, right? She was of the mind that, well, yeah, the body is just meat, and when you're gone, everybody should fill out an organ donor card, right? And I think that to bring this back to Williams, I kind of had this tinge of horror when I went to fill out an organ donor card. When I was contemplating it, I was like, I didn't want to picture this sort of macabre end from my body, this unnatural yanking out of organs from my thorax. And I guess that that whole thing seemed like too grim a confrontation with physical reality for me. So I chickened out at the time, which of course is completely irrational, right? I should rather have parts of me live on in other bodies, right? If I'm so connected to my body, I should want my liver and my heart to carry on in other people's bodies happily rather than being eaten by worms or consumed by fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where body horror comes from, right? I was thinking for a future philosophy and literature class, I mean, body horror is pretty hard to sit through, but this might be a movie that you could, or an essay that you could pair with a body horror movie.
Yeah.
David Cronenberg.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Eraserhead in that context. That one is rife with body horror.
Yeah, I don't like it, so I stay away, but I've only seen one David Cronenberg, but it's striking for sure. But anyways, that movie probably kept me from becoming a father for an extra decade. It's like, oh, that's what it's like. Oh boy.
I tell you what, girls, if you want to scare away your boyfriend, if you really want to, truncate your future with him, just take him to see Eraserhead. Yeah. And
good advice.
Yeah.
I've never seen it. I that's just a guess, but sounds sound.
Well, one of the main characters is this sort of like baby prop that's always like it just looks unwell and never stops crying and is always burbling up all sorts of foul fluids, and it's this wretched living thing, and it's rotting and dying in slow motion in front of this guy who is kind of charged with taking care of it.
Oh my god.
And it's just body horror and the misery of being mortal, kind of just all packed into this little room with a noisy radiator.
Sounds great.
Yeah, and then that's life sometimes, right? I mean, it isn't all. And I think as you put it, right, that's the allure of philosophy in some regards, right? We can sanitize part of the horror of being alive by parceling it off into easily parsable concepts and making everything look like math or Legos instead of just a pile of awful on the floor. Right? So
well, fallible, okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's the horror of the butcher shop or the peace of mind offered to you by analytic philosophy. You choose, Zan. You choose. There's only two ways out. That's putting maybe too fine a point on it, but I do think, right, like that philosophy is best when it uses the tools at its disposal, tools of analysis, to approach topics that are messy and are off-putting. Right? I think that's a challenge. But I think it's a challenge that if philosophy is going to remain vital and relevant, it has to take on.
Yeah, I agree. You've really warmed me up to this article. I was hostile at first, but yeah, that's the spin I needed.
We brought you back around.
Yeah, sure did. I like philosophy again. I'm doubling down.
Another philosophy student saved. Well, my work here is done.
Your soul is saved. You've transcended your body. All right. Anything else?
No, Zan, thanks for coming out and talking about Bernard Williams this week, and we'll see you next week for more of the same, or perhaps something even more delightful. We'll see.